Hey, I'm back for chapter 3. I might be doing these in 2 parts going forward because I don't like how long uh, it takes me to get through the chapters. Not that it really matters because you can stop it anytime you need and play it back or play it forward when you get to the next section. But it's taking forever for these to upload to my computer. Excuse me, upload to YouTube. I live in a rural area, so when internet speed is slow, which is like 90% of the time, I mean, it'll take 4 hours to upload a 20-minute video. So these are taking forever. So I'm thinking that I might break the chapter into 2 parts and see if it goes any faster. If it doesn't go any faster, I won't worry about it, I guess. So chapter 3. They start off talking about leadership behavior and styles, and they give us kind of a heads up that how this chapter is broken up. So doing it in 2 parts might be useful anyway. The first part, if I break it up, I'll do it in the first part talking about the 4 behavior leadership models, and then discussing the 7 motivational theories, like in the second part. So this chapter can like make your head blow up a little bit. So don't overthink it, and I'm going to try to just break it down into what they're really trying to say, because it's sort of a lot of research here. This is all about the different research approaches that different universities took and the results of that. It's kind of a history lesson of how did we ever get to where we are today with this participative style of leadership being the goal. It came from a lot of effort and research and paying attention to what we were doing, prior to X number of decades. And as the workplace changed and the workforce changed, we started to see what was more effective and what wasn't. So it's kind of a history lesson, which I love history, but not maybe everybody else doesn't. But I love the topic and understanding. For me, I like to look at things in the big picture. So how did we get from here to here? Rather than just tell me about what's going on now, it's like, well, how the heck did we know that that's the right thing to do, right? So this is talking about theories that are based on what we do and what we say, right? Now, there is a caveat to that, and the book points it out. They note here, unfortunately, no leadership behaviors were found to be consistently associated with leadership effectiveness, right? So that's why we evolve into the next step. It's like, wow, we did all this research and found out, well, that wasn't necessarily the right answer. But that's great, because then we have to go on and try to find the right answer. So it starts off with the work that leadership styles and the work that the University of Iowa did, the Iowa research segment here. And they looked at a combination of the traits, the skills, and the behaviors the leaders used as they interacted with followers, right? So this was developed like in the 1930s. So the University of Iowa boiled it down into like basically 2 camps, the autocratic and the democratic camp. And you can read it in the book here too, the autocratic leadership style. They make the decisions, they tell employees what to do, and they closely supervise people. I'm sorry, but if you're a micromanager, you are living in that camp, and no one will like you for it. In most cases. Sometimes micromanagement is needed, depending on the task, level of difficulty, the importance. I mean, if it's life and death, the surgeon is going to be very autocratic, as it probably should be, right? But on the other hand, we've also learned that surgeons that are a little bit more democratic might be more willing to listen to somebody who is, let's say, below them on the food chain. If they disagree and say, no, I think you actually left your sock inside that person as you stitched them up. And the autocratic surgeon says, I paid attention to everything I do. Who are you to tell me what to do, right? And one that's a little bit, got one little toe in the democratic camp might say, I can't imagine that I left my sock in there. But I'm going to check because I trust you. You're a good employee. You're a good coworker, whatever. I'm going to trust you. Oh my God, there's my sock. How'd that get in there, right? Believe me, because we hear these stories about the wrong leg being cut off, and it's horrific, and it happens. So anyway, that's what the Iowa State kind of came up with. And they didn't, and they just like it had on a continuum. So if you look on Exhibit 3.1, you can see the autocratic to the democratic continuum. Now, if you are, autocratic 100%, you're just going to tell everybody what to do. Kind of think military. And I know it's not all autocratic, but that's a good example, to tell your soldiers what to do, and they do it. Then you can kind of move up the continuum to being democratic. There isn't necessarily, I mean, there's a middle road too, but people generally have their go-to place. Like people that are very participative and they want input from others, they're automatically in that democratic camp. Then we move on to the 1940s and the 1950s, and what was happening here at the University of Michigan and Ohio. Their studies, they started to think about this because now we've moved on a few decades, haven't we? They started to realize, in their studies, started to find out that leadership behavior and effectiveness had more to do with success than in a specific style, so to speak. That's why you guys are going to be taking these surveys to kind of figure out where you're at with this. So in the University of Michigan, their results came up with these two different styles, right? They looked at whether you were going to be more job-centered or employee-centered. So if you look at Exhibit 3.2, with the one with the big fat M on it, they were looking at, when you take the survey, you'll get your score. Were you more job-centered or were you more employee-centered? That's just another way, and you're starting to get where they're coming up with some of the same results with different verbiage. So the job-centered is more task-oriented. Now, we've heard that before, haven't we, in the earlier chapter reading? So you're more task-oriented. You're more worried about the job getting done, right, than necessarily your people. Whereas the employee-centered leadership style is much more concerned with their people. And again, you can see how they put this in this in Exhibit 3.2 with the big M, that there's a continuum, right? That's not necessarily a great thing to be completely job-centered or completely employee-centered. You have to have somewhere in between. So then we move on to what the Ohio State University, what they came up with. They came up with two styles as well, but they called theirs initiating structure versus consideration behavior. So their style number one, they just gave it a different name, but when you boiled it down, this initiating structure behavior was in essence the same as like the job-centered style or being task-oriented. And their consideration behavior was more along the same lines as that employee-centered leadership style or being more people-oriented. Now you might think like, well, why the heck do we even need to know this, right? If they're coming up with the same result, why can't they all call it the same thing? Well, we don't know the validity of studies and research if we're not having independent studies. And if the independent studies come up with the same answers, you are much more likely that they are correct, in generally speaking. Right? So they had different names, but they came back and they go, basically, look at that. This has kind of turned out like, well, maybe we're on to something here, right? So what they ended up looking at is the Ohio State University leadership model. Now they call it the Ohio State Leadership University model. They combined four things. They combined like these four things into their styles, and you can read it here. They presented in this way. Identifying the four leadership styles as either low structure or high consideration. High structure or high consideration. You could also then have low structure and low consideration and high structure and high consideration. I know, blah, 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 blah. Well, thank goodness for these diagrams, right? Because just what I said, they put into a diagram. Look at Exhibit 3.3. This has got the big O on it, right? I think it's green. It's either green or gray. Kind of looks greenish, grayish to me. But anyway, it's got the big O on it. So when Ohio State, when they put these four things together, you can see on the bottom axis, right? I think that's the right terminology, or is the left from the axis? I don't remember. Doesn't matter. On the bottom, you can see it goes from low to high. And when you talked about that initiating structure, again, this is about talking about being task-oriented, job-center-oriented, right? Worrying more about getting the job and completing the tasks than anything else. So you can have some people that are kind of low, where like, well, we get her done, this is no real big deal, all the way up to high, which is, oh, Hail Mary, here we go, right? You better get everything done, or you're going to work overtime for life. And then on the left side, we have the consideration part of the axis, right? Or part of this diagram, because I'm probably using the wrong words. Not very scientific that way. And that's where they wrote that, have consideration. Now, again, this is the employee-centered, meeting the needs of the people. You're much more considered with how well people are doing. So if you're on the low end of that, again, it's like, well, don't really care how you feel about anything. I need to just do this, or I want to do that, or whatever. You've probably all met that person, right? Oh gosh, I've worked for all of these people. Oh. And then you have the ones that are high, like they consider the welfare of their people above all things, right? So what they did was, how could you mix these up? And what I did, and what I would like you to do, is put a name of somebody, a former boss or current boss. Put your current boss somewhere, but think about other people in your life, personal or professional. Put their name in one of those boxes. So I have someone's name in the bottom left quadrant there for low structure and low consideration. This person was a nightmare to work for. Not a bad person, nice as heck, but in the workplace it was awful. It was harder than heck to get anything done because they would just get off on this, oh my God, that's so exciting, let's go try this. You weren't even done doing this, and they were off doing that, right? So we didn't get anything done. So there was low consideration about completing our task, getting the job done. And then they also, though, had low in consideration. They were very, their EQ, or emotional intelligence, where other people were concerned, was like almost zero. Like I said, very nice person, everything, but their needs and their thought, everything was about them. And they were very incapable of reading other people's emotions. Like they were upset, or like, why do people keep quitting? I sit down and go, oh my gosh, right? So I have somebody's name there. Now on the bottom right-hand side, I have someone's name there as well. They have very low, and you can see how they're mixing these up, both low and high, right? So the bottom corner, low consideration and high structure. So this person, the high structure, was all about getting everything done, right? Busy, busy, busy. They're always busy. One of those people, I've been drinking a soda here. It's not a soda, it's a water or something or other. So this is the person where they put it here, and you walked by and you bumped it and moved it over here. Oh my gosh, they would run back over and move it over here. A little scary, right? Everything has to be perfect, have to be neat as a pin. Everything has to be and everything's just like constantly, right? But extreme low consideration for people, or how they felt about things. Again, very nice person, and socially a lot of people like this person. They don't work with this person. They don't see this other side to them. And I did not work for this person, but I knew people who did, intimately close people close to me that worked for this person, and it was the same conversation. Like, oh my gosh, I've never met a more inconsiderate employer boss in my life. So again, high turnover rates, right? Now you move to the top half of the quadrant. On the top left, you have that high consideration, low structure. So you can see how this is starting to change. They have a much higher consideration for people, the people that work for them, but they don't necessarily have high structure. And I have a name of somebody there too. But again, they're a little bit higher in the quadrant, right? So they weren't over the top in either one, but it was frustrating because they didn't necessarily get as much done as they could. They didn't necessarily make changes in a timely manner so you could grow the business, kind of thing. So again, people might not have, the turnover rate there might not have been as high because they also had very high consideration, for people. But people get frustrated if they can't get their job done, right? And then you have on the top right, high structure and high consideration. I have somebody's name there too. They're always considered with getting the job done. I shouldn't confuse by using that word. They were very conscientious about getting the job done. So consideration was high for them. And if they had to make the tough decisions, they did. But they did it with kindness. Believe it or not, you can fire people with kindness, because I've done it. It's horrible no matter what. And this is one of the things that makes it hard for me, like in a leadership program or a leadership class. And this is, I probably have a mix of people and programs that are in this course, having a fully online class. It's very hard to explain the feeling that you get in your chest to look someone in the eye and take their job away, to take their livelihood away, even if they deserve it. they have kids, they have families, they have lives, and you just took their income away. You just fired them. Like I said, even if they deserve it, you get home at night and you don't feel that great about it. At least maybe you shouldn't. No, I've met some horrible people, but so this person was one of those that had a very high EQ. She could read people really well, but she was also very conscientious about the job being done. And I worked for this person too, and I probably never would have quit. She actually passed away. So yeah, I ended up leaving, but because of the replacement. Anyway, so I think this diagram explains that way better than anything. And then the book talks a little bit about what each of these contributions or each of these models, what they contributed to where we are today. And that's not as important as just understanding, as we've looked at 3 different ways that scientists examined leadership, but each one had a contribution into leading us to where we are today towards this participative style of leadership. So now let's go on to the next section, which is the leadership grid. And I love this. Now this is like now we're up to like the 1960s plus, right? And I think it's like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even, oh yeah, here it is, even into the 90s, right? And this again is talking about this realization that you have to have both the concern for production and the concern for people, right? You can't be too far off the mark. And they came up with the 5 different leadership styles. So again, if you look at Exhibit 3.4, we can look at the same type of grid. They kind of came up with the same thing, right? And you'll take some surveys somewhere around in here to come up with your score. I think my score ended up, so if we're looking at Exhibit 3.4, Blake, Moten, and McCant's leadership grid, and it shows the low to high concern for production, which is just like in the other one, right? The concern for initiating structure. And on the left-hand side was the concern for people. So they kind of ended up coming up with the same thing when they did their research. And they labeled them, though, which I think is fabulous. So the impoverished leader would be like the 1.1, bottom left-hand side. Low concern for production, low concern for people. Kind of just like the big old Ohio State model we just looked at, right? But I like that they gave them cool names. Then if you go to the top left, that was the authority compliance leader. They got the 9-1. High concern for production, low concern for people. Now, I love the country club leader because I actually worked for someone like that too. Excuse me. The country club leader is the 1 and 9 because they have a high concern for people, low concern for production. They were fun, really fun, but we got nothing done. They didn't stay in business long. Then you have the middle of the road, which is the 5.5, which is smack dab in the middle, kind of a balanced, medium concern for both. And then you have what's called the team leader. That's the 9-9. That's in that top right section. And when I do my scores on these things, I come out as the 8-10. So for me, I'm generally a 10 with my concern for my high concern for people. Well, I fluctuate between 8-10 and 10-8 actually, depending on the job, which you'll see a lot. But for me, I'm still in that upper right hand side because the bottom line for me is always that we don't get anything done. We don't get any of this production done without our people, right? So what I'd like for you to do is read those 5 excuse me, labels again and see if you can put somebody's name to them, because I've got a name for every one of them in my quadrants, which I won't share with people. Change the names to protect the innocent, right? Now the leadership grid and the high leadership research, I think that's pretty interesting. High is that 9-9, the top right hand corner. There is some research that really challenges to say that that's the best, right? Because there's a caveat to all of this, and the fact that is it ever possible to be a 9-9? Right? Can you always be considerate of people and considerate of production? So there's some caveats to that too. So that's the next few decades of research, right? Now the behavioral theory contributions and applications. This is where I need for you to really think about your project, the ED project. This chapter has a lot to do with your employee development project. If you can understand these leadership styles and look at that and say, oh, wow, maybe I'm just a little bit too, after reading this, you might think about the work you're doing with your subject and think, oh my, I think I'm country club. I just say yes to everything, or I just don't have an opinion. I'm kind of in the middle. Or, oh my gosh, maybe you know, I'm kind of an impoverished leader. I really don't seem to demonstrate, now not that you don't care, but you don't necessarily demonstrate that how important both are, right? So we don't need to read the contributions. You can read that yourself. Now, the third part of this, or in the beginning of this chapter, talks about the 4 different models. This third model, leadership and major motivation theories. First, you kind of have to understand a little about what does motivation mean. They describe it here as anything that affects behavior in pursuing a certain outcome. You can't really get any more detailed than that because motivation is a mystery. What motivates people to do what they do, we may never know. Right? But there is a motivation process. And here they talk about through the motivation process, people go from need to motivate to behavior to consequence to satisfaction or dissatisfaction. Then they have 3.5, exhibit 3.5 sort of shows how that's a circular model, right? We have a need, and then whatever motivates us makes us behave in a certain way. We see what the consequences are. They're either good or bad, and we start over, right? What was Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So if you were to look at that, and if you were dissatisfied every time, but kept doing it again, what motivates somebody to do that? Oh, it's fascinating stuff. Oh my gosh. Because whether it's rational or not, you just look and you go, gosh, what were you thinking? Like, why did they do that? My girlfriend, we celebrated 50 years of friendship this year. I was like the 9th child at their home, and their dad, oh my God, his favorite word was dumbass, right? And to this day, it's my favorite word because he'd look at us kids after we do something, you know, and he would never use the word like stupid. He took it under his breath, he'd say, dumbass. It's hilarious. Anyway, it kind of speaks to this. Like, what were they thinking? We don't know. We don't know why they do what they do. Now, this is where I'm going to end this section. I think it's good, right about the 21 minute mark here. And I'm going to do part 2. And then that's where we're going to get into this overview of the 3 major classifications of the motivation theories and the content motivation theories. This is the 4th chunk that we're talking about in this chapter. And that's where we're going to look at these 7 different motivational theories together. Okay, so we'll do that in part 2. Lots to think about in this part 1. Oh gosh, I love this stuff, trying to figure out why people do. If in another life, or if I wasn't so darn old, I think I'd go back and get my PhD in industrial psychology. That's the study of, and believe me, it's a really hot area to get a job in these days. It's the study of why we do what we do at work. Exciting stuff. All right, see you for part 2.